It's a slap in the face that vast majority working class people pay Social Security taxes on their entire paycheck, and yet their bosses do not.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
The State of the Union now was probably, what, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I guess, Adam?
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a minute, and for some reason, when Joe Biden said that Republicans want to cut Social Security, I forget his exact words, but it was something like, it's their dream or whatever to cut Social Security. And in the moment, they acted like this was crazy. They was like, oh, booing. There was somebody called him liar. And that was just really bizarre. And the protestations kept coming out for the next week or two about how, no, actually Republicans don't want to cut Social Security. Nobody wants to cut Social Security. In fact, it's so horrible of you to besmirch our good name with, the idea that we would want to cut a popular government program. Like, this is so, anti everything that we're about. This is what the Republicans were saying. And, and one of the people that I saw do this that was really kind of one of the silliest ones or one of the strangest ones was Cameron Smith from AL.com, because he tries to, his branding is like, I'm conservative, not crazy. You know that kind of guy, right? He wants to differentiate himself from the radical right-wingers, and he's an opinion columnist for AL.com. And he tweeted, that Biden knows this is a lie. And then he wrote a whole article about it in which he both says that Republicans don't fantasize about cutting. Here's a quote from his article. Republicans don't fantasize about cutting Social Security benefits and Medicare. In fact, most Republicans in Congress don't have the political courage to reform Social Security and preserve it for future generations.
So they won't do it, and that's a bad thing, is what he's trying to say. Okay.
But then he says, he quotes some stuff from Republicans advocating cuts to Medicare and Social Security. And so in the article, again, he mentions that Biden has been using a 2010 clip of Mike Lee running for office, in which, and he says this in the article, so I guess kudos to him. Mike Lee says, quote, "It will be my objective to phase out Social Security, to pull it up by the roots and get rid of it." And then Cameron Smith goes on to say, in most instances, Biden and Democrats omit the age of the clip, and Lee also saying at the same 2010 event that current Medicare beneficiaries should have their benefits left untouched. So it's just like, folks that are 30 or 40 or 50 that he wants to steal from, right? It's not the people that are currently, have Social Security and Medicare ostensibly that he wants to steal from. It's us. Then he also mentions that Senator Ron Johnson talking on a radio program saying we've got to turn everything into discretionary spending so it's all evaluated so that we can fix problems or fix programs that are broken that are going to go bankrupt. Because, again, as long as things are on autopilot, we just continue to pile up debt. And he says, Cameron Smith says Johnson's remarks are not a cut either unless Congress refuses to reauthorize the program. And sure, we could say if we're babies being children about it, being coy, that Johnson here is not advocating for a cut. But you don't try to put Social Security and Medicare into discretionary spending because you want to strengthen it.
Right. It's the exact same thing Republicans say in Alabama about the Education Trust Fund.
Right. The idea that, and Cameron Smith is a smart guy. I've read his articles for ages, for years. He's a smart guy. He knows, he has to know. He just has to know that what he's saying is BS. Is BS here. Because You don't put something at risk of being cut or at risk of even sunsetting to strengthen it. That's not how it works. And that's the reason that this is unpopular, that Rick Scott's plan is unpopular, because people know that if you allow Congress every single year to reauthorize spending, then it becomes more likely that the spending does not get reauthorized, as opposed to you have it in this separate thing that keeps going on automatic pilot, as Ron Johnson derisively called it. And so, but you can see through his words here that he's actually like, oh no, they really should cut it and just call it reform.
Well, and I was just going to say that, you know, another way of saying autopilot would be a, you know, defined benefit,
Right.
a guaranteed benefit. Typically, we prefer those to be on autopilot, but, you know, that's just me. Silly old me expecting
Exactly.
that something you pay into your whole life will be there when you need it. But
Right.
hey,
It's just, it's the idea that you would get upset about this is just so silly. It's and I wrote a piece in AL.com and I expanded on it on our website, tvlr.fm. It's the first article that comes up if you go to tvlr.fm. But, you know, I say that a hit dog will holler, and this is what's happening, right? And we know that that's what's happening because we can just look and see. And one of the most concrete thing that I mentioned in the article is that the Republican Study Committee, which is a caucus in the House of Representatives, which is not a small marginal group, even though you probably haven't heard of them much like I hadn't. They, you know, the Freedom Caucus gets a lot more press coverage, but the Republican Study Committee has 3 times as many members as the Freedom Caucus. Okay, so this is a much more, the Republican Study Committee, if there is any caucus in the House that is representative of the Republican mainstream, it is the Republican Study Committee. And only a year ago, like 12 months ago, they put out a proposal, a whole budget. That this is what they said, this is our ideal budget for the United States government. And in it, there are portions about Medicare and Social Security. And so we can just look at those. We can just look at them. For Medicare, they propose increasing the eligibility age by 2 years, from 65 to 67. For Social Security, they want to raise the retirement age from 67 to 70. 3 years. Now, you know, obviously it's easy to intuit that this is a cut, right? You hear, you know, I'm going to be getting this payment later. That means I'm going to be getting less money. In the final analysis, I get less money when the payments start later. That's easy to figure out if you're not trying to be some, you know, galaxy brain genius Republican commentator. But just how much less? Just how much less? In real terms, quote unquote, raising the retirement age to 70 for Social Security means a 20% cut in benefits. A 20% cut. That's a lot. That is a lot of money. Raising the eligibility age for Medicare to 67 means saddling 65 and 66-year-olds with thousands of dollars more each year in healthcare costs. And it would also mean that Americans would spend more money on healthcare because, while the federal government would save money, it would only do so by shifting the burden to elderly individuals, employers, and Medicaid, which are all less efficient than Medicare. And this is easy to understand, right? Because if Medicare is not paying for healthcare for 65 and 66-year-olds, that healthcare, those costs don't just disappear. They don't just go into a vacuum and they get healthcare for free for some reason. Somebody has to pay for it. Somebody has to pay for it. And if it's not going to be Medicare, they're going to have to pay it out of pocket. They're probably going to have to pay for it by waiting to retire. Their employer is going to have to pay for it, or Medicaid is going to have to pay for it. All of those options are less efficient than Medicare. And that's just, like I said, just from last year, from the most mainstream of mainstream Republican caucuses in the House of Representatives in D.C. This is what they're proposing: a 20% cut in Social Security benefits and thousands of dollars every year for 65 and 66-year-olds in healthcare costs. But of course, you do have people like Mike Lee wanting to just abolish the things. And then you also have politicians, which is the most politician answers, like Kevin McCarthy back in October when he was saying about this debt ceiling about these upcoming debt ceiling negotiations. Kevin McCarthy refused to say whether or not Medicare and Social Security would be on the chopping block in these negotiations. And that's like a super politician thing. Oh, I don't know. I'm not going to predetermine. I'm not going to predetermine it. Maybe we'll steal from old people, but maybe we won't. Who knows? We'll see. We'll see. That's what Kevin McCarthy was saying in October. And of course, since then, he's taken that off the table. But so just in recent history, within the last year, we can see there is an appetite among the Republicans that are elected to cut Social Security and Medicare. And that is not anomalous. Conservative Republicans have always been opposed to these programs, like they're opposed to any programs that help working people, right? That's kind of their MO. For the American Prospect, Richard Esco noted that Republicans claimed the effect of these programs would be like, quote unquote, the lash of a dictator while they were being debated. While people were debating in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House about whether or not to implement Social Security and Medicare, that was some of the debate that was some of the words that Republicans said in opposition to these programs. They said this would be like the lash of a dictator. And that tradition of continuing to liken programs that support working people in their old age to despotism was also continued by Barry Goldwater in his 1960 book, The Conscience of a Conservative. This is not anomalous. This is totally in the conservative Republican tradition. Cutting Social Security and Medicare, not implementing it in the first place. And of course, talking about, is it despotism for old people to have health care, right? Is it despotism for old people not to be in poverty? Anybody living in the real world can see that those arguments are silly, because far from restricting the freedom of seniors, these programs have brought and kept millions out of poverty. Before Medicare and Social Security, roughly half of seniors were poor. Today, that number is less than 10%, and without those programs, it's estimated that elder poverty would again shoot up to nearly 40%. And so, I want you to let that sink in and then ask yourself, and ask anybody who has been both poor and not poor, under which set of circumstances they felt more free. And there you're going to have your rebuttal to Goldwater, right? Because obviously you feel more free when you're not poor. It's obvious. And, and I've been talking about how Republicans have been historically opposed to Medicare and Social Security, but I don't want to paint like a misleading picture, right? Because the only real champions for these programs have been, organizations like unions, elderly advocacy organizations, and occasionally, the good progressive Democrat or a Democrat that's been pressured by their base to support these programs. Democratic politicians have also locked arms with Republicans in the past to attempt to destroy these programs. And in fact, no less than Biden himself was playing the role of a fiscal hawk in the 70s, saying that we should freeze federal spending, including Social Security and Medicare. Most recently, Obama was willing to execute cuts to the program, but Republicans at the time were not willing to take yes for an answer, because Obama back in, what was that? When was that, Adam? 2012, 2014? He was willing to cut Social Security and Medicare, basically implement their program in exchange for raising taxes a little bit on the rich.
His so-called grand bargain.
Yeah, to try to bring the deficit in line. And Republicans were like, yes, we hate poor people, but we love our wealthy donors more. And so, we can't stomach a tax increase on wealthy people, even if we would be able to, steal money from poor people. We just can't do it. But fortunately, that's really not the case anymore. And of course, there's probably some Democrats that, like, in the privacy of their offices or whatever, they agree that, cutting these programs is important or whatever. But that's not the open position. They can't say that anymore because it's just not politically tenable. And so, meanwhile, Republicans, as illustrated above, are still very much interested in pursuing cuts. And now one of the things that people like Cameron Smith are going to try to do to advocate cuts is they're going to dress the cuts up as the only way to save the programs.
Right. We've got to cut from a little bit here, a little bit there, so that everybody else can still get some benefit.
Right. So, that's what they say. This is the only way to save the program, and therefore it's not a cut. And so we'll get to why that's wrong in a minute. It's not the only way to save the program. But even if it was, that wouldn't make it not a cut, right? To create a too descriptive analogy, if your doctor were to recommend amputation, to save your life, that would be a cut, like in the most literal sense, that would still be a cut. It would be cutting off your arm. Now, maybe it's good to cut off your arm in this instance because maybe there's an infection in it that's going to kill you if you don't cut it off, but it's still a cut. You got to understand that. Right? And union bargaining committees are going to do this all the time as well. They're going to, a good union bargaining committee, once they get the best that they think they can from the company, they're going to tell their members and say, look, these are the pros, these are the cons, and here's a cut here, but you get this here. And you let the people decide if that makes sense. But people like Cameron Smith, they're not willing to do that. They're not willing to just say, cuts are necessary to save the program. But it's also clear that cuts are not necessary to save the program. Because while it's true that, in 2034, Social Security payments are going to be cut by 23% if the program's left alone. And in 2028, Medicare will only be able to cover an estimated 90% of hospital costs, hospital payment costs. And so there's definitely changes needed, but cuts aren't the only way to do that. There are other ways to save the programs. And one way, which was released before Cameron's article, and so the idea that he didn't know about this when he wrote the article, trying to make it seem like cuts were the only way to save the program, that's kind of absurd. But Bernie Sanders, he reintroduced his Social Security Expansion Act, which would not only maintain the current level of payments, but actually increase the payments by $2,400 a year for Social Security.
Right. It would protect the program for 75 years.
Yes. So he would increase the payments and make sure that it's viable for 75 years. Wow. How does he do that? Does he expropriate all of the wealth in America? Does he take away all the companies? Does he execute Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos? Is that how he pays for all of this? No. The only thing that he does is he lifts the Social Security tax cap on income over $250,000. That just means that a millionaire, somebody who's making millions of dollars a year, is going to pay the same amount into Social Security as a percentage of their income as you do, as I do. Because all of our income is taxed at 7% towards Social Security up to $160,000. And then for some reason, every dollar you make over $160,000 doesn't get taxed. Doesn't get taxed for Social Security. And so you have this bizarre situation where, these people are supposed to love small business owners. A small business owner making $160,000 a year pays the same into Social Security as a multi-millionaire does as a real value. How does that make any sense? How does that make any sense? It doesn't. It doesn't make any sense. So all it does is have people pay the same rate that working people do if they're millionaires into Social Security. And you get to expand the program. So there we go. And then, look, that's not even the only way to do it. For less drastic measures, you could just raise the cap incrementally to keep the same level of payments. There's several ways to save the programs. And then for Medicare, there are lots of proposals that would allow Medicare to cut spending by negotiating drug costs and increase revenue by increasing taxes on people and corporations that disproportionately benefited from the pandemic without forcing Medicare recipients to pay more for health care. There are lots of options on the table besides making poor people and old people pay more. But that's not what Republicans want to do. But we can have that conversation. But to do that, we got to be honest about it. And the honest assessment of every single Republican proposal to quote unquote reform Social Security is that senior citizens get less. Every single one. You cannot show me a single Republican policy proposal that saves Social Security and Medicare that doesn't mean you get less in old age. Not a one. Doesn't exist. And contrary to what Republicans and maybe even some conservative Democrats will say, when they propose that working people get less in old age, that is a cut. That's a cut.
Bottom line, I mean,
Yeah.
and we should accept no cuts to any of our benefits that were hard won, hard fought, and frankly are insufficient as they are. Mm-hmm. And to the idea that we would cut even further is cruel and completely unnecessary in a country of such great wealth, the wealthiest country in the history of the world. You're telling me we can't afford Medicare and Social Security? It's absurd, and as you point out, it is just a means to protect those who are already wealthy. It's a slap in the face that vast majority working class people pay Social Security taxes on their entire paycheck, and yet their bosses do not. Doesn't make sense.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.